welcome to our latest Piano 101 podcast. Today we're going to talk about gesture in piano playing, and what we mean by gesture, how gesture assists and informs our playing, and also how it influences the audience and those watching us play, because I think that's a very, very important consideration. So to begin, Michael, why don't you define gesture when we're talking about piano playing? How do we define gesture?
For me, gesture means the physical movement of the performer in relation to the music. I think that's what it means to me in the most basic terms.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, I think that's what gesture is in general. It's a movement that relates to some kind of thought, emotion, or activity. I think at the most basic level, and I think I remember from when I was teaching very young or very beginner students, I think one of the first gestures that you teach is how to create springy staccato, and encouraging kids in particular, and adults actually, to enjoy the sensation of the finger and the wrist and the forearm actually bouncing off the keyboard. And I think that's a very simple but clear example of how gesture is related to technique and how we articulate the notes. And obviously, by the same token, a very smooth movement in the hand and arm, and actually the rest of the body, I think, particularly the upper body, will influence the sound that one creates if you're trying to achieve a beautiful legato. So I think those are two good examples of gesture as it really does serve the music in terms of creating the kind of sound and sound effect that we're after. Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think you're right. I think the most basic gesture that I teach any beginner to play the piano is to drop their arm on the piano, that sort of stuff. I mean, if you can't do that, then on the keyboard, then forget it. Then you can't play the keyboard. I mean, anyone should be able to do that, that to drop your arm. And of course, linked into what you say, in terms of staccato, then, when the pianist gets a bit more advanced, then we talk about, is it arm staccato? Is it wristy staccato? Is it finger staccato? Does it come from the hips? Oh, of course, but staccato is obviously the more easier, one of the more straightforward gestures to execute. Shall I say? For me, one of the more complicated one is the slur, really, what I call the Mozart slur, the baby slur, where I always say, you drop your wrist and then you roll, you drop your arm and you roll the wrist. They call the classic drop and roll. That is quite tricky. But apart from that, no, I think I can be old-fashioned. Maybe I am old-fashioned, but I always say that the pianists or the musicians, or the performers, I think that's a better term. The performance physical gesture should reflect the music that they're performing. And I think I've been thinking about this, and I think, if you look at if we're gonna look at different types of performers in the classical music world, those are generally the most gesticulate, are those that perform from memory. That in my opinion, like singers, violinists, pianists, pianists. Funny enough, I think there is something to be said about this business of the music comes across as it's meant to be like improvisory, spontaneous, and you've been possessed by this sort of like entity from beyond the grave, and then you're like captured by the music and you're playing the music, and I think it's like, I mean, like you say in your article, I mean, it's all to do with the stage is essentially a platform for the performer to show off, but there is definitely, as we all agree, too much gesticulation, too much gestures, completely over the top gestures that doesn't have anything to do with the music that the performer's playing,
I think what you just said, just to backtrack slightly about people performing from memory, I think that's a really interesting point. And I mean, you know, my particular views on performing from memory, which is slightly to do with my own inability to play from memory. But I think that there is a valid point that perhaps that liberates you. I mean, I have to say that I have seen awful gestures, awful distracting gestures from pianists who play from memory or don't. And we'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. But that's a very interesting point, actually. I think I'm sure that it does give one a sense of liberation. And that's that's important. So
yes, it is. So, sorry to interrupt you, Fran, but I think that is one of the advantage of playing for memories, that it gives you that freedom to be able to play the music. It's not impossible when you play from the score. It's just a bit more difficult. That's all. In my opinion, I've seen very committed and beautiful performance from people playing by the score, you know, with the score in front of them, and I don't care. I mean, we spoke about this, memory or no memory. You know, you want to play from you know, play the music. And another thing that's this last thing before you I'll let you talk, that I just remembered, that when it comes to gesture, it's also physical gesture at times you know, the performers in pianists, I'm talking as a pianist, of releasing tension, for example. I mean, the legendary South African you know, piano teacher Laura So, you know, she's very keen to get her you know, students to do pot stirring, you know, that pot stirring action, you know, like to release the, you know, the tension. Of course, you know, I feel that it's the teacher's job to help the student to find a gesture that is essentially unique to them, that is not contrived or forced. You know, there is nothing worse than a teacher try to impose their own sense of personality or their sense of own gesture, you know, in the performer. I mean, I've seen this, you know, from time to time, where you have a very talented student who plays very still, you know, you know, and sits very still and play the piano, and some of the gesture that comes from some of the physical gestures that they incorporate, it's not necessarily their own. It's actually what the teacher tells us to do, and it comes across as slightly fake and slightly contrived. You know, if you see where I'm coming from.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I mentioned to you when we were planning this podcast that I've been watching a young musician competition.
Yes.
And obviously there, because it's televised, the camera is up close and personal with the performers. And I think it's also because the pianists are not front facing. We always observe pianists side on. The camera is really getting up close to them, and we're seeing a lot of facial expressions, a lot of eyes raised heavenward, and heads flung back, which I know is a trait of certain Georgian pianist who we both know about. And I was watching it the other day, and it's quite clear, actually, to just touch on what you said about teachers encouraging gesture, or saying to a student, you should do this because it will say such and such emotion. And it's very clear, to me at least, that some of these young people are being told to make a particular gesture at a particular point in the music, and it does come across as slightly artificial and contrived. I am very, very against the eyes raised heavenward in general. I don't see what it brings to the music. I really don't. So I think that the thing that really interests me, actually, I have in the past, less so now, go and see a lot of pianists performing in concerts. And there are one or two who I will name who are some of the most still people at the piano, possibly the most contained and self-contained as a pianist for me is Marc-Andre Hamelin. And I actually had a conversation with him a while ago, a very brief conversation on Twitter, actually in response to one of my articles about gesture, where he said, what's the point? There's no point to it. It doesn't make any difference. And when you watch him play, there is such economy of movement, and almost no extra gesture beyond what literally serves the music in terms of articulation or expression. Another one is Stephen Huff. I actually had the privilege of seeing him perform where I was with Lee. Actually, we were only about a meter away from the piano, in a regional theatre, and he was playing the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto, and it was so interesting because again his economy of movement was extraordinary. No wasted movement at all. You know, especially in fast passages where the arm and hand have got to move across the keyboard very quickly. There's no kind of floating the hand over or anything like that because it's not necessary. Every so often, perhaps to I think more to inform the narrative or create drama, he might spring the hands off the keyboard or remain very quiet with the hands just either still attached to the keys or floating and coming away very gently, which you don't want to fly off the keys at the end of a very sort of intimate Chopin nocturne, for example, when you're playing pianissimo. We have to also consider gesture in relation to the mood and emotion of the music, don't we?
No, I get that completely, and of course they're not the only ones. I mean, I look at the pianists. I'm also quite old-fashioned, and the pianists that I admire, people like Horowitz, Bolle, Arrau, Radulescu, Gilels. These are great. Zirkin. These are great musicians, and who play very still. I mean, Zirkin, it's probably the exception to the case that he's very difficult to watch because he gets lost into this like titanic life and death battle, and it's almost like he's interpreting the music and this sheer agony that's come across in his face, which is quite opposite to some of the new generation of pianists that I see on social media that make everything look so easy and facile. And there is something to be said about that. But there still needs to be a sort of engagement. You can sometimes when things are too easy, you almost fail to engage show the audience you're engaging with the music. In my opinion. No, I completely agree with you. And look, and I don't mind. That say, I mean, you made a point that you don't want to like finish this Chopin nocturne with a big flourish at the end, which makes no sense. But similarly, when you play a piece like, say for example, the Liszt Fourth Transcendental Subies Mazeppa, when you finally got to the massive D major chord, you want the big flourish, and you're not going to keep very still on the piano. You want a sense of big, like, oh, I've done that, that sort of stuff. So I think that's what we meant when we say going back, to the gestures, the physical gestures of the performer should ideally, I'm being old-fashioned again, reflect the music. But having said that, we're all on social media, and the younger generation is not so much about how I might get crucified for saying this. It's not so much for how you play, is how you look, that sort of stuff. And if you excuse the language here, and if you, or me being direct here, but if you want to look like you're someone who's having an orgasm every 4 bars in the musical phrase, and be at it, that sort of stuff. Don't expect me to come to your concert, that sort of stuff. I'm sorry to say, I know you're laughing because that is true.
No, I agree with you. We're on to now the ones who are extreme in their gestures. We don't need to name any, but in a way, I mean, what you just said about we live in a very visual age now, and
yes.
And actually, performing music is a form of theatre, so there has to be a degree of acting, as it were, through gesture. But I do feel now sometimes when I watch pianists that the extreme gesture is a sort of a way of, I suppose it's a form of attention seeking in some respects. I guess that certain performers believe that they're doing it and it's genuine and it's fine, but it's when it gets in the way that I begin to find it difficult. It's when it actually is a distraction from the music I'm fully in agreement with you about big gestures in big music, as it were,
Yeah,
and small, still, contained gestures
yeah.
of very intimate or quiet music or whatever. But I think when you're looking at the performance theatrics more than you're concentrating on the music, there's something not quite right there.
And, and it's not just gesture, it's also facial expression
Yes.
as well. I mean, I recently started following a hilarious Spanish pianist who doesn't take herself seriously at all, and she does podcasts and broadcasts and all this. And one of her favorite things to do is that she imitates classical pianists, and she does a fantastic job in doing them. I mean, I wouldn't tell you who that is. I mean, we can sort of more or less guess who that is. You know, that's what, but she's absolutely brilliant at doing that. I actually must drop her a quick message. I did say to her, I really enjoy your videos, and that's fine. But for I don't want to say, you know, seasoned professional or something. Maybe I'm just too old for or all this sort of stuff. But I just find it distracting and it gets in the way. And it's like you say, it's unnecessary. And if I go to see a live concert and someone has all these ridiculous facial expression who's got nothing to do with the music and all this sort of, then it's okay. You know, I mean, the best I'll do is I'll just close my eyes and try to listen to the music, you know.
That's one of the reasons why I always tend to sit at the back when I'm at the Wigmore Hall.
Yeah.
I can't see, and then I can focus on the sound. If you're too close, you see too much. And again, if it's televised and you're watching on a TV broadcast, the camera is lingering over the face, and it's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, I think thinking about Richter, how he played almost in complete darkness. Now, his reason for that was more about, I think the quote is something along the lines of, well, why would people want to watch me working? Which could possibly
actually
sounds a little bit precious, doesn't it?
Yeah. So his actual quote was, someone asked him, I think it was Bruno Mansagnon, the interviewer, the director asked him, so one shouldn't watch. And then he says, watch what? Such as what do you want to watch? And then I think he went on to say that because the gesture, the movement, and the how do you say, the expression on the face, it all expresses work towards the music. You shouldn't see that. You should actually listen. You know, that sort of thing. And to be honest with you, Richter's movement, they're not excessive. It's not excessive at all. I would say that he's very conservative, you know, quite conservative. So I agree with you there.
I do think that the you know, pianists like that from a earlier generation, I think it is possibly partly the lack of the influence of television that perhaps I don't know, that there's something in that. Maybe it's another discussion with, you know, or someone's going to write a paper about it for us. But I would have thought that television has influenced, I mean, not just pianists, but other musicians. I mean, I can think of a few who have really capitalized on the camera being on them, for what you know, for better or worse, as it were. Just going back to teaching, because this is something that really interested me when I was teaching. And I was given, so when I had piano lessons in the 1970s, I was taught in a very old-fashioned way, where you sat at the piano in a very kind of four-square, rigid way, you know, very little freedom. It was almost like your elbows were glued to your sides. The hands, you know, there was very little kind of give and take, as it were, a very rigid playing. And I suspect the sound I made wasn't particularly nice. And it was actually when I went back to lessons as an adult that I realized how much I had missed or had missed out on by not being taught gestures in it. Going back to the basic things we were just talking about at the beginning, in particular the drop slur. My teacher, the teacher I had as an adult, had a wonderful technique for teaching the drop slur, which was literally to let the arm fall as if
Mhm.
it was a heavy weight that was falling onto the keyboard. Getting
You'd be surprised. A lot of people can't let
no,
their arms drop,
no, they
just
can't.
fall. It's actually astonishing.
I was going to say that
Mm. Yeah.
teaching that piece of technique to my students, many of
Mm.
them, the kids were better actually. I think children are much more
Mm.
open, and they're less,
Yes, yes, yes.
aren't they? They're not worried
Yeah.
about looking like an idiot when they do something like that. You know, and I used to do things like, imagine that your arm is, I don't know, a stone falling into the ocean or something.
Mm.
You give them a visual cue and it makes it a lot easier, but certainly trying to teach adults that piece of technique, they didn't want to let go. They, you know.
Can I remember in our masterclass earlier this year, there was and you know, I remember correctly when I sit on when I get one of the participants, I think it was Howard or something, to sit on the floor to try to feel the weight of the arm.
Yes.
I was actually quite surprised that he did that, because not a lot of when I try to explain that concept of how heavy the arm is, to feel the weight of the arm, not a lot of people wants to sit on the floor to try that, you know,
No.
because it make them look, you know, silly, basically. But I don't mind that. There is one way of getting around. So I completely agree with you. I think children have that sort of sense of more exuberance, that sort of innocence, you
Yeah.
know, that to the West, like you say, adults are learners are a bit more aware, a bit more not aware, a bit more how to say yeah, aware of how they might come across.
Yeah, there's a respect,
Exactly.
isn't there, about stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, from my point of view, when my teacher showed me this
Mm.
arm movement to create a perfect drop slur, you know, the way the um hand falls onto the keyboard with using the weight of the arm,
Yes.
float. So she would say, you drop and then float. That was her. I know you have a slightly different way of describing basically the
Yeah.
same piece of technique.
Yes, yes, yes.
But I think the revelation for me was that it actually worked, and it was
Yes.
perfect. And every time it works, and it works
Mm.
perfectly. And I think there you see gesture really 100% serving the music, and it's such an easy thing to do. It's hard to teach. It's
Yeah.
hard to encourage, as just been saying, hard to encourage people
Yeah.
to let go. But when you
A
show
lot of people, yeah.
show
Sorry to
them that
interrupt
it
you, friend.
works,
A lot of
yeah,
people, yeah.
you go ahead.
Going back to the slur, the drop slur, a lot of people find it difficult because they try to do with just the fingers, and it doesn't work. And even when I ask them to drop the arm, to feel to drop the arm, they don't really drop the arm. They just, you know, they just drop like this. Then of course, if your arm's not dropped, then you can't roll the wrist. You
Exactly.
see, then this happens, then
Yeah.
you know, then they have to lift the wrist, you know. And you know, gestures and physical movement, I think all that basically has two functions. It's to serve the music. It's just to help us to play the music better. Basically, that's what it is. And also to relieve stress and tension in our playing. I always say that, you know, there's in the most basic terms, that's three gestures that one learns on the piano in the most basic form. So I mean, I don't want to sound like Mr. Miyagi in the old Karate Kid, you know. I mean, have you seen Karate Kid? Like, you know, there's up and down, you know, there's up and down, and then side to side, then the side to side movements, you know, that, and then finally that rotation movement, which is very important. And those three for me, it's the most basic, you know. And then of course there are variations on that. But how, like you said, how a teacher describe that or implement that in the student, it's very different depending on how receptive the student is, you know, or how much of a genius the teacher is.
I think that I think vertical movements such as for you know, a springing on and off the keys for a staccato,
Yeah.
An arm staccato,
Yeah.
which is the most straightforward staccato that you teach to
Mm.
your early students. I think those gestures are very easy and conceptually are easy.
Mm.
But I think the more complicated is when we're trying to teach beautiful legato playing,
Mm.
because you have to think horizontally.
Mm. And then when we play,
but we're
we play
using,
vertically.
yeah, we needed vertical movement to actually
Yes.
activate the mechanism of the piano. And I know from my teaching experience that some people conceptually found that very, very difficult to think horizontally, and to
You're not the only one. Your
no,
students are
I'm
not the
sure,
only
I'm
one.
sure. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it is for a lot of people, there's a kind of mental block about it. You know, you have to use a vertical movement to make the sound, and yet you've got to think horizontally, and you've got to keep
Especially,
our movements very,
especially,
very smooth. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Fran. I just want to say this before I forget. Especially when the music is written in chords, that's very difficult. You know, I remember bringing, parts of the Brahms First Piano Concerto to Neil Immelman, and then the second theme, tom, pom, 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 ta, ta, da, 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 when the piano has that big solo. Of course, all that's written in chord. And then I drew a little cross on top of that section. And I remember he looked at that and he was like, what is this cross? Is this some strange religious symbol? So I said to him, no, I said it meant for me, what it symbolizes is that the music is written vertically and yet we have to think horizontally. And then that's why he was like, oh, okay, so I think I completely agree with you.
Maybe if our music was written in a different way, we'd approach it differently. But I mean,
Yes.
the example I can think of, and a piece that I struggled with, and then it suddenly made sense, was the Debussy Sarabande, from Paula Piano. Is it from? Yeah, which is all chords, and they're massive, big, rich Debussy chords, and yet it's meant to be legato, and it's got to be very smooth, and yeah, it took me a long time to learn that and play it in the manner in which it should be played, as it were. But that was a very good exercise in this sort of vertical versus horizontal playing, I suppose. Yeah, it's a beautiful piece, actually. I should revisit it. Yeah, and so something else actually that came from that, which I then was able to translate into my own teaching, and is a very good thing to do with kids in particular. So my teacher said, you've got to imagine that you're actually just glued to the keys.
Oh yeah.
You are glued to those keys, and so the only movements you can make are sideways, horizontal.
Yes.
So
it would be as close to the keys as possible. Yes.
Yeah. And I went away and tried this little bit of teaching wisdom on one of my very bright students. And I said, you have to imagine that you're glued to the keys in order to create this beautiful smooth sound. He turned to me and he said, well, Fran, if I was glued to the keys, I wouldn't be able to leave your house. You just think, yep.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Which was one of the funniest, those are the funny things that you remember from teaching when kids come out with stuff like that. But he was a very literal little boy. But he kind of got it, actually. Another thing that I found was very helpful, actually, again, with dealing with the concept of this horizontal movement. And I can't remember where I got this one from, but it was imagining that you're trying to contain water under your fingers. And you can't let it run away. So you need that constant contact or seemingly constant contact. So I do think that we can teach gesture by creating these kinds of visual cues and calling on the imagination to help. Because I think, as I said, I think conceptually some of these things are quite difficult, and they're not all. I've also found that they're not always that easy to demonstrate, because sometimes you're using quite small movements, and so you just need a bit of extra something to help guide the student into what you're asking them to do. Yeah.
I mean, look, for example, I mean, if we're going to talk about physical gestures, I mean, the most basic thing that I find like recently is that, I mean, when we all are learned to play arpeggio, we've been all asked to tuck our thumb underneath, so do you see the thumb under approach? But now there is also another approach where the thumb goes over. you know, the thumb over and the thumb under, you know, that sort of stuff. So it's quite a revolutionary way, but I started looking into that. And at the end of the day, I think that the truth is somewhere in between,
Sure.
really. And it's, you know, it's up to us to find, like I said, always said, you know, it's up to the teacher to help the student find a gesture that works for him or her, you know, as opposed to try to impart our own ideas, as you know, that sort of stuff.
Oh, I think that goes back to what we say nearly every time we have this conversation.
Yeah.
There's no right way.
No.
About finding a way that is most comfortable for you personally as a player, or for your student. And you know, the dogmatic teachers are not really helping their students if they're saying that it's only this way. Yeah, but you know, hopefully that's beginning to change. I'm not sure. Yeah. So we like gesture when it serves the music, and by which we mean, you know, technically and emotionally. So I think we can probably both agree that we're sending to Room 101 this time all those extravagant, flamboyant gestures that just get in the way. Or are we going to allow some flamboyance in playing?
I think you can be as I think if the music requires agility, flamboyance, by all means goes for it, you know, that sort of stuff. But for me, it's a combination of doing silly facial expression that has nothing to do with the music, or doing facial expression which is just for the camera, and that wrapped up with unnecessary, you know, sort of like big movements, you know, of the body that's slightly irritating, you know, to say the least. Okay, and I get it. Everyone's personal, because there is sometimes the way you release tension is the way you lift your body. You know, you lift your arm, and everything is very, very personal. You know, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. But who am I to say? You know.
Well, quite. Yeah, we're not the last word on this. Actually,
Exactly.
It's just occurred to me that Glenn Gould and his humming.
Yeah.
In a way, that's a form of gesture, I
Of course
guess.
it is. Yes.
And I mean, you know, some people absolutely adore that and think it's a wonderful thing to hear him humming on recordings. And I think others find it deeply irritating. But I think that we have to just let him have it, because it's part of his character. But I have been to concerts, and I do wonder sometimes whether things like grunting and snuffling and even a bit of humming are unconscious gestures, and perhaps the performer isn't even aware of it. But I do remember one occasion in my favorite Beethoven sonata, which is the Opus 110, in the Arioso, when the music dies back, and we have that extraordinary moment of, you know, kind of between two worlds, as it were, life and death. We're going to be philosophical. And the pianist started grunting quite audibly at that moment, and I was so furious. And then afterwards, I thought about it. I saw the same person perform a few other times, and the grunting seemed to happen at quite odd moments. It didn't seem to be. It obviously wasn't related to the emotional aspects of the music. So I do wonder whether some people do these things and they don't even know they're doing it.
Well, I mean, look, but Fran, I don't want to sound brutal here, but there is no excuse for this, because we have technology at our disposal. All you have to do is to record yourself playing on your camera, and that will sort you out. That's how I see it. I mean, I might sound like really clinical in saying this, but look, but I remember, you know, when I was learning Brahms's F-sharp minor sonata, and I recorded myself, and I couldn't believe how unsynchronized my hands were, you know, but no one, and it's one of those things that unless you heard it yourself and you're aware of it, no one's going to tell you. Am I making sense?
Absolutely. And I think that as a tool for practice, recording and filming in particular is incredibly helpful.
Very, and I don't understand why more pianists don't do it. I encourage all my students to do it, especially before they submit to the their pieces for that online exam, or they do a submission, or they're preparing for an exam, for goodness sake, record yourself. I mean, the camera, it's there. It's a machine. It doesn't have feelings. It'll tell you honestly what you are doing. And if you can learn from that, fabulous. Rubinstein said that his greatest teacher is listening to his recordings.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I think that a few of them do need to just go back to the studio and that sort
of course. But many of them are, and I don't want to mention names again, are superstars and are dubbed as superstars, and they are in fact being held as generation defining talents. So what do they have to improve?
Well, yes, I mean, and we know who we're both thinking about, and actually, in his defense, I would say that the flamboyance has become part of his musical persona.
Okay.
And in a way, that's fine, because somebody with that level of superstar status, they can basically do what they like, and people will still flock to see him play. The interesting thing,
that's fine, but
yeah, it is
just
fine.
don't expect.
No,
Yeah,
that's
great.
It's not to my
exactly.
taste, but
just don't expect me to buy a ticket. That's all.
But I mean, I saw him live in London when he was 18, playing, I think, Rachmaninoff at the Proms, and there was none of that. It hadn't developed at that time. And then on another occasion, I went to see him at the Royal Albert Hall again, in a solo concert which was wonderful in a way, because the audience was mostly young people, a lot of children, and that was lovely to see. And he played the Bach Italian Concerto, and the outer movements were full of I thought unnecessary movement, but in the middle movement, in the slow movement, he seemed to forget that he was this showman. And because there were cameras set up so you could watch on the big screen, and obviously the camera lingered quite closely on the performer, and at that moment it was actually really wonderful, because we just had the music and a very contained physical presence on the part of the performer, and it was actually really lovely. So he can do it.
No, definitely. Look, I think some of his earlier recordings, I can live with that. But with this person, it's just it's a combination of, if he's not doing big unnecessary gesture, then it's really sort of unnecessary facial expression. So and then there are times when the two combines, and it's just, and this might sound like I'm having a go at him. I'm not, that sort of stuff, because I think he is a generational defining talent, and playing the piano and piano playing will not be where it is today, because if it's not because of him, that sort of stuff. But for someone so exceedingly talented and who is so brilliant, I expect a lot more. I think, for me, in my opinion, I think, we can all speculate, but is it, the teachers, does the teacher also have to take responsibility, to say that actually, just tone it down, or is it part of his management team will say that, well, actually we need more drama, your manager. We don't know. We can only speculate speculate these sort of stuff,
I think that's actually a very interesting point, to go back to the young musician competition, that I am seeing young musicians who are being coached to behave in a certain way at the piano, and I'm just not comfortable with it, because it's unnatural. And again, when you see gesture which doesn't feel appropriate or comfortable, as it were, again, that can feel distracting. And it doesn't have to be particularly big gestures or flamboyant movements. It's just this sense that somebody has said, well, you should do this when you play this passage. And I'm not comfortable with that. All of these things, I guess, in the end, we develop our own personal gestures and movements. And some of us are more gestural than others, and that's fine. And I guess these things develop over time and with experience. But I'm very uncomfortable with the notion that teachers are saying to students, look, you need to do this because you're going to be in this competition, and if you don't do this particular movement at this point, or you throw your head back and your hair hangs.
Please don't say that.
Yeah,
That really
just,
annoys me.
I know. It's
I unfortunately
very
throwing the head back.
very artificial, isn't it? And
Yeah, unfortunately, throwing the head back that doesn't work for me because I don't have any hair. So, it doesn't have that dramatic effect, that sort of. I mean, 25 years ago when I have flowing long locks, then, maybe that works, I think it's time that we have to consign something to Room 101. So I think this time
Yes.
you can go first.
Well, really what I've just said, that I would consign to Room 101 anything that's contrived and seems artificial or expresses false sentiment. I'm quite okay with gesture when it obviously it serves the music, whether it's technically or emotionally. I have seen some flamboyance which has irritated me, but at other times I've seen it and thought that's completely appropriate because of the nature of the music and the kind of drama that the performer is trying to convey. So yeah, I mean, I'm just going to send in the artificial stuff to Room 101. What about you?
Yeah, I would say, I agree with that. And for me also I want to consign to Room 101 that it's a teaching thing, and like what we said before, I just want to reiterate that in my opinion, a good teacher should, should not try to enforce their own physical gestures onto the students. It's teachers job to help the students find what is natural for them. That's all it is.
I think
and
that
and also like not silly facial expressions as well. So I mean,
no gurning. It's a no gurning zone. And on that bombshell, I think we'll bring our conversation to a close until next time. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks, Fran. Awesome.